future-mindedness. I have argued in this chapter that more frequent collective rituals contributed to the rise of large-scale groups during the Neolithic Revolution by helping to stabilize cultural identity markers, or, to put it more simply, that routinized rituals helped create bigger groups. But there is another, as yet unexplored reason why routinized rituals would have been useful to early farmers, and that is how they influenced our attitude to the future. Farming and future-mindedness go hand in hand. I first learned this during my first week at university as an eager 18-year-old undergraduate. One of my teachers, James Woodburn, had shocked the anthropological community by returning from his field work among the Hadza of Tanzania, declaring that he had found a cultural group with no social organization. His colleagues at the London School of Economics still talked about the hubbub this caused. The cries of disbelief and the murmuring of skepticism continued to echo down the corridors of the anthropology department. When asked about this matter directly, however, Woodburn said his colleagues were exaggerating. It was not exactly that the Hadza lacked social organization, but that their social groupings were highly flexible. People could come and go as they pleased, and there were no strong expectations of group loyalty or reciprocity. Food tended to be hunted or gathered informally on a day-to-day basis and was shared with little concern for who received what, a form of pooling that Woodburn likened to a system of taxation in which the unproductive were subsidized without sanction or stigma. The very young and or elderly tended to benefit, but this evened out in the long run because they will either contribute more in the future or had done so in the past. This helped to make Hadza society very equal. All the kinds of resources that would normally be used as a basis for social inequality, wealth, power, and status, were quite evenly distributed. Food and possessions could not be stockpiled because the Hadza were nomadics.
Nomadic.
Nomadic. The Hadza were nomadic, and they needed to travel light. Nobody could boss anybody else around because everyone had access to the same basic weapons. Gender inequality was also minimal because women tended to form solidary support groups at the level of the band rather than being separated off into domestic units, potentially dominated by patriarchal aggressive husbands, and differences of status was actively prevented through the application of what Woodburn referred to as leveling mechanisms, norms that actively inhabited expressions of pride and competitiveness. Woodburn described these societies as egalitarian, and he referred to their mode of subsistence as immediate return economy. Woodburn had highlighted one of the key distinctions between simple hunter-gatherer societies and more complex ones. If you make your living from hunting and foraging in small bands, the prospect of a bigger reward in the future is usually less compelling than the assurance of a smaller reward right now. Woodburn observed that more complex hunter-gatherer societies, such as those found on the northwest coast of Canada, had a delayed return economy depending on elaborate dams and weirs, which requires careful forward planning and coordinated efforts.
Weir.
But what struck me as I listened to Woodburn's argument was that the shift away from short-term thinking was far more pronounced and enduring in society that abandoned hunting and gathering altogether and took up farming. Farmers must wait patiently for crops to grow and for domesticated animals to mature before they are eaten, and so a hand-to-mouth existence is no longer viable. A more future-minded approach to life is acquired, not only in order to ensure that the food supply is available when needed, but also, as we shall see, to facilitate its distribution in a way that ensures everybody gets to eat. In this way, the invention of farming led to newfound dependence on technologies of food production and storage, and made planning ahead absolutely essential. Once you have to wait for crops to grow and ripen, and once ownership of produce, Produce. Ownership of produce is associated with individuals and families rather than the entire tribe. It becomes very difficult to sustain an immediate return lifestyle. It is now necessary to store food for times of hardship or to find ways of ensuring that surpluses are continuously being moved around so that the better off can subsidize the less well-off in times of need. Delayed return economies introduce new challenges for human societies. One of the most basic was the need to ensure that the whole community would be sufficiently well provisioned that nobody would go hungry during lean periods. Archaeologists trying to understand how this problem was addressed in Neolithic prehistory often refer to a book entitled Stone Age Economics, written not by a specialist in some field of prehistory, but by an anthropologist like me, called Marshall Salins. One of Salin's great insights was that the rise of agriculture had a significant effect on the social units that made up a community. He argued that agriculture favors a domestic mode of production in which the household becomes the primary unit of production, consumption, and exchange, instead of the band functioning as the main economic unit for procuring and sharing the resources needed for survival. Families become settled into distinct dwellings formed around a common hearth rather than a collective campfire. But while this is an effective way of organizing small-scale farming, marriage, and child-rearing, it also has certain downsides. Perhaps the biggest problem with the domestic mode of production is that all households are at some point unfavorably composed in terms of ratio. Ratio. Ratio of effective producers to dependent consumers. Young households had many hungry mouths to feed, and relatively few have many hungry mouths to fill, mouths to feed, and relatively few capable adults. Long-established households have drudgery founders. Drudgery ratio.
Doddery.
Drudgery.
Doddery.
Doddery.
Toddler. Doddery. Doddery founders whose more capable dependents have found the nest and are taken up with the challenges of supporting families of their own. If domestic units were left to fend for themselves in such a system, based on immediate return thinking, it would soon lead to disaster in the form of widespread household failure. Such communities needed to develop ways of organizing households into larger support networks. Systems capable of encouraging stronger households to subsidize the ones that might be ailing. Ailing. Such communities needed to develop ways of organizing households into larger support network system capable of encouraging stronger households to subsidize the ones that might be ailing. There is some debate among archaeologists about exactly when the household first emerged as the main unit of economic life in the Neolithic. Some suggest that the evidence for autonomous households can be traced back to the very early in the Neolithic, around 10,000 years ago, while others argued it was closer to 9,000 years ago, around the time of the invention of pottery, and this also seemed to be consistent with the evidence from Katahoyuk. But whichever account we follow, it seems that the household came to be an increasingly important feature of economic life among settled farmers, and this meant that the risk of household failure needed to be addressed. Somehow, these ancient Neolithic societies needed to find a way of consistently thinking ahead like never before. In the case of our Neolithic farmers, it seems to have been the clusters of innovations that have addressed this problem. One of these was the rise of the so-called history houses. This term alludes to the way households became the repositories of especially rich and varied material culture thought to be associated with the telling of the stories about the past. The distinguishing feature of these houses is that they contained more human remains buried under the floor, more artworks painted on their walls, or more heads and horns of animals embedded into the plasterwork. For example, at Ketahoyok, I saw evidence that human remains had been extracted from under the floors of houses where they had been buried, not only once but multiple times, and not only within recent memories of the primary burials, but sometimes many years later. After most of all those who would have known the disease had themselves passed away. It is easy to see how this would have promoted a more future-oriented outlook by creating more elaborate narratives about the past. People tend to see themselves as part of the long-term and unfolding history, which existed before they were born and would continue after they died. The impact of historical narrative on legacy thinking is difficult to demonstrate using direct evidence from archaeology alone. However, another plausible indicator is the growth of high-frequency domestic rituals at Ketahoyok. As we will see in Chapter 7, we now have experimental evidence that participation in routinized rituals had a remarkable knack for helping people defer gratification. In other words, routinized rituals make us more future-minded. This suggests that the increasing frequency and standardization and of ritual life over the course of the Neolithic would also have fostered growing concern with future prevision and planning. But if history houses and routinized rituals encourage people to look ahead more than in the past, and therefore to prioritize future provisioning more than their foraging barriers had done, they did not provide a mechanism to actually share agricultural surpluses with vulnerable households. Concretely, what was to be done about those elderly or childbearing families who couldn't pronounce enough food to get by? This is where another key innovation come in, a greater focus on collective rituals and community-wide applications. Archaeologists have argued that tendency towards the atomization of households in the Neolithic will have been motivated by competing introducements to contribute to community life. Wait. Okay. Bye. For example, upon visiting another Neolithic site not from Ketahoyok, I discovered that even though the household emerged as key economic units, there was also strong evidence for the activities operating at a high level. There I found evidence for larger-scale collective activities, outdoor ceremonies, the sharing of meat, cooperative foraging and farming and collective rituals, dances and feasting events. Through these rituals, the tendency towards the isolation or individual households will have been counteracted by obligations to circulate surpluses around the community. In some cases, these activities seem to have been rooted in elaborate gift-giving rituals in which different households feel socially compelled to offer their surpluses to others as gifts. Indeed, Saline suggested that the main way in which ancient societies solved the problem of household autonomy and the domestic mode of production was through the rise of superordinate forms of cooperation, functioning above the level of individual domestic units, from household clusters to much more descendant. Descent groups, and the chief among these forms of cooperation was an emphasis on reciprocal gift-giving. Although evidence for gift exchange in Neolithic societies is limited in the surviving archaeology, it seems likely that reciprocal obligations between households were among the factors driving surplus production and the circulation of food. We now operate in the world in which the need for future-mindedness community-level organization is self-evident that it is difficult to comprehend the significance for these changes during the Neolithic, but between them, these convergent innovations, history houses, more routinized rituals, and community-wide obligation for reciprocity seems to have overcome the biggest problem facing the earliest farming communities. The fact that a purely household-based economy could not survive without some higher level of cooperation and forward planning. History houses foster future-mindedness while community traditions and obligation created the mechanisms to share food surpluses with families who might otherwise go hungry. Routinized rituals, meanwhile, not only help the first agricultural community grow in size, they help them think ahead more effectively than ever before. The positive role of rituals in human history has taken me a long time to appreciate, in part because I have had a difficult relationship with rituals personally. This is not so unusual. Many of my fellow academics study the things they find particularly difficult to master or understand. Political scientists often strike me as poor strategists in departmental politics. Anthropologists struggle with the nuisance of their own native groups. And geographers are often the colleagues most in need. Spanish. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. Political scientists often strike me as poor strategists in departmental politics. Anthropologists struggle with the nuisance of their own native groups, and geographers often the colleagues more in need of direction around the campus. Deutsch, Guten. Although my job is to study rituals, I find them Scottish, Irish, Although my job is to study rituals, I find them rather offensive, particularly the routinized kind where we are obliged to participate in at school in the form of assemblies and chapel services. These activities seemed at the time to be not only pointless and dull, but sometimes even menacingly oppressive and authoritarian. I'm not alone in thinking this way, of course. As we will see in the final part of this book, many societies were shedding light on shedding their ritual traditions at a rapid pace, not only through secularization but by dismissing as irrelevant or oppressive many long-established rituals associated with schooling. Professional guilds, the institutions of government and everyday domestic life. However, the more I have learned about the effects of participation in frequent collective rituals, the more I have come to appreciate their importance in fostering large-scale cohesion, cooperation, and future-mindedness. I have argued that ritual routinization helped the first farmers settle down and create larger and larger cultural groups, but this was only the beginning of a much more complex process. As we close the current chapter on the Neolithic transition, we open a new one with an even more surprising storyline. This is a story in which routinization not only helped larger groups to form and stabilize, but also to become dominated by leaders wielding previously unimaginable powers. Some of these new leaders were treated as gods. Many established highly repressive regimes founded on slavery and human sacrifice. This is the point at which we leave the Neolithic behind and venture with trepidation into the Bronze Age. Trepidatious, intrepid. Dauntless, intrepid, dauntless, dreadnought. Okay, bye.